Thanks very much, and thank you for battling your way through some very English weather conditions to get here. I was very pleased to see so many people. So, as Henry said, I'm now working in the team we call Neurobiology of Executive Functions with Emmanuel Prosick here. And it's a pleasure to be the first of the small fish, as it were, in the Cortex talks to talk about my work, but I hope I can nevertheless tell you something interesting about learning to learn and how that relates to what prefrontal cortex does. So in the team, we're interested in this slightly amorphous concept called executive function. And so I've just listed a few versions of some of the things that are thought to contribute to executive function. Manu, when he talked the other day, a few weeks ago, talked quite a lot about detecting and reacting to outcomes, one of these elements of executive functions. And executive functions we tend to completely associate with a region, a set of regions in the frontal cortex of the primate brain. And here I'm showing you an example on a macaque-monkey brain because almost all the work I'm going to talk about today is done in macaque monkeys as a model and within their frontal cortex. So here we've got two example regions that are very much implicated in executive functions. Cingulate cortex, which Manu talked a lot about when he gave his presentation, and this is lateral part of prefrontal cortex, which I'm going to really focus on today. So a lot of the work that implicates frontal cortex and executive functions is correlative in nature. You find some form of activity in the brain, be it bold signal, be it the firing of cells, and you correlate that with some complex task that involves the processes, the executive processes that I showed just before. But the correlative approach lacks one piece of information. It is unable to tell you whether that region of the brain that correlates is actually critical for that function. In order to know whether a region of the brain is critical for a function, you have to intervene on the brain, you have to perform a lesion, and you have to see whether, without that part of the brain, you can continue to carry out the function involved. And so what I'm going to talk about here is some lesion experiments. And these lesion experiments use tasks that are much simpler than a lot of the executive function tasks, but the aim is to show that prefrontal cortex here and the frontal regions that are involved in executive function are actually also involved in much simpler tasks which show us the mechanisms behind these complex executive tasks. And so in other words, I'm going to use simple learning and memory tasks to try and give a window on mechanism of executive function. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how we get monkeys, and we get humans as well, to make good decisions, and specifically focusing on two elements of decisions, making decisions efficiently and making them flexibly. So I like to give the conclusions at the start of the talk so you know where you're going. So this is the moral of the story. What I'm going to try and argue is that decisions become efficient and flexible when subjects learn to learn, that this is the route into making good decisions, and that the sets, and the word set is something I'm going to explain to you shortly, the sets formed by learning to learn require the process of processing of temporally complex events, again something I'll explain shortly, and that this is a fundamental role of prefrontal cortex. And in doing all that, I'm hoping to show that the function of cortical interactions can be more informative than the function of individual regions, and that lesions can be used to reveal both criticality but also mechanism. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Let's find the simplest decision we can ask a monkey or indeed a human to do. And it's a choice between two things. So in the decision-making literature and the executive function literature, we would say this is a simple choice between two items. In the learning literature, we would say that this is a two-choice discrimination. You're asked to choose one of these objects, and one of them will have a positive outcome for you, be associated with reward. If you're humans, you're going to read the word and suggest, oh, well, it's probably this one. If you're a monkey, you're going to do this by trial and error and work out how to get your reward by, for example, touching one of these objects, and there's your reward. Okay, so this two-choice discrimination is the simplest possible decision task that we can use, that we can test. And throughout the talk, I'm going to use this sort of schema to explain these tasks as I build them up towards more executive tasks. So here the letters are referring to stimuli in these cases, A for one stimulus, B for another, and the plus it gives you the association of reward with those stimuli. So the A plus means that A is rewarded and B is not. So in the simplest possible task, in each trial, which is a line here, in each trial, A is associated with a reward and B is not. Very simple. Monkeys can learn this. Monkeys can learn this, but they can't learn it as quickly as some people might interpret. So here's some data from Harlow, a classic experiment where you ask monkeys to do exactly what I've just shown you over a series of 16 different pairs of objects. And what you can see is that little by little, with more and more trials, the monkey's performance, this is % correct, improves over time. So this is a gradual learning process. Now, in the human case, you might expect that we have some magic mechanism that allows us to learn much quicker this sort of problem. And that's true in the case of adults, but it's not true when you start out. So here are some data from 3 to 4-year-old children who show exactly the same learning curve on the same task. So this is something relatively general in primate cortex when it's starting out or when it's evolutionarily basic. And this process has very much been associated with mechanisms in the temporal lobe. So mechanisms in the hippocampus, in inferior temporal cortex, are thought to be involved in associating the reward with the identity of the object. And there's a vast literature on this. If you remove temporal cortex, you can't do this task. So here we are, very simple decision, it's just temporal cortex, right? And the answer to that is no, that the prefrontal cortex, despite this being the simplest possible task, the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in this task. Here's a group of monkeys from a study by Amanda Parker in 1998, and these monkeys are learning exactly the task I've just shown you with a group of 10 objects. And this is their errors to criterion. They're quite good at the task. They're only making 5 errors to get to criterion. If we remove one half of their prefrontal cortex, doesn't matter which half, they're just as good at the task. However, if we remove their whole prefrontal cortex, a bilateral lesion of prefrontal cortex, the monkeys can't do this task. Okay, the F stands for failure. These monkeys are not able to learn a simple two-choice discrimination unless they've got some prefrontal cortex in place. Okay, so the simplest possible task, classically associated with temporal lobe, actually requires prefrontal cortex. Well, prefrontal cortex is a big region, you're probably thinking. Which bit of prefrontal cortex is important? Well, we could therefore try and subdivide prefrontal cortex and find the bits of areas that contributes to the different bits of this task, perhaps. But that's quite difficult because there's very little agreement on how you subdivide prefrontal cortex. Here are just a few attempts at doing it using mainly cytoarchitecture, but also cytoarchitecture and connections more recently. And what you can see is that the maps that these different authors come up with are very, very variable. So the idea of subdividing prefrontal cortex, as opposed to separating prefrontal from non-prefrontal cortex, is a rather difficult anatomical question. Nevertheless, we wanted to try and work out what on earth prefrontal cortex is contributing to this very specific, which bits, of prefrontal cortex are contributing to this very specific and strong impairment. And so we carried out a series of lesion studies with 4 groups of monkeys. Here you can see 3 groups with different lesions in blue, okay? Ventrolateral, dorsolateral, and orbital prefrontal lesions. And we also had a group of monkeys with a total prefrontal lesion, which is the lesion in gray. The idea being that the 3 lesions combined together give you a total lesion of prefrontal cortex. So in some sense, we want to break down the huge impairment we see in this incredibly simple task into its different constituent anatomical parts. And as you can see, there is no significant impairment at all when you do a subtotal lesion of prefrontal cortex, but when you take the whole thing out, you get a massive impairment. That's a strange result. It's also present in a slightly more complex version of the task. We call this object-in-place scene learning. I don't want to go into the huge amount of detail in this task, but effectively, the monkeys are finding these little objects. One of them is rewarded, but they're aided by this strange-looking scene in the background so that their learning gets very much better. And again, we get the same effect here. Subtotal lesions of prefrontal cortex do virtually nothing to the task, but monkeys with a total prefrontal cortical lesion are very significantly impaired. So, what does this mean? Well, what we can say from this is that prefrontal cortex as a whole is necessary even for the simplest decision, which can also be thought of as the simplest possible learning task. But you don't need any particular bit of it. That's a strange conclusion to make. And it's fair to say that in lesioning the whole of prefrontal cortex in both hemispheres, we're using a relatively blunt instrument in order to try and understand this task. And I fully admit that there are certain interpretations that might question our conclusion. So that brings up the idea of how can we refine our idea of what the specific role of prefrontal cortex is in these very simple tasks. And one way is to start by thinking, well, in taking out the whole of prefrontal cortex, we're stopping prefrontal cortex from interacting, as we know anatomically it does, with a huge array of cortical and subcortical structures. So can we, in some way, limit the way in which we're stopping these interactions, and therefore limit the domains in which we're stopping prefrontal cortical function? And the way we go about doing that is by cortical disconnection, the idea of disconnecting prefrontal cortex from another region whilst leaving the prefrontal cortex other functions and other interactions completely intact. So cortical disconnection, there are three ways of doing it. One way is to cut white matter tracts between cortical regions. You have to get lucky with the anatomy in order to be able to do that in a specific and targeted way. Another way is the technique of cross-unilateral disconnection, which I'm about to tell you about. And the third way is to inactivate regions of one region of cortex and record from another region, thereby being able to see how that region reacts with and without the input from the second region that you've inactivated. And that's the technique that I'm using here in Lyon, and I'll talk about a little bit at the end if I have some time. So I'm going to talk now about cross-unilateral disconnection. It's a lesion technique that allows you to disconnect cortical regions. And this is based on a couple of lucky bits of monkey anatomy. The first thing is that unilateral cortical ablations in the monkey have very little effect outside primary sensory regions, so there's no hemispheric specialization. The second is that connections between different cortical areas are mainly within hemisphere, and therefore a cross-unilateral ablation of cortical area A in one hemisphere and cortical area B in another hemisphere selectively impairs the interaction between A and B, but it leaves in place some A and B in the other hemisphere to do the other functions of A and B. And the specific example that I'm going to use here, we're doing cross-unilateral disconnection between inferior temporal cortex and prefrontal cortex. Inferior temporal cortex subserves visual object identification. So if you have no inferior temporal cortex, you can't do any task that requires you to identify visual objects. And we're using that as a tool for carrying out tasks with visual objects in them. And what we want to say is, what does prefrontal cortex do with visual object identity information? So, if prefrontal cortex subserves some general function, and I hope I've argued successfully that it seems to subserve some general function in almost all tasks, then disconnection of prefrontal cortex from inferior temporal cortex should selectively disrupt that general function, but only in the realm of visual objects. So we can be very specific about what prefrontal cortex is doing with visual object identity information. Here's an extremely simple schematic just to get the concept very solid in your heads. I see I'm sorry, there's some French which has crept in here. So here is prefrontal cortex on two hemispheres of the brain and inferior temporal cortex, and this is roughly how they're connected. And the thing that we're saying is that there are very few, or they've been identified, very few connections that do this, that cross the hemisphere and go into other regions. And certainly the effect of cutting the corpus callosum which is relatively minimal in the monkey, to say negligible, is evidence for that. So a classic lesion is a bilateral lesion. You take out the same region in both hemispheres of the brain. In a crossed unilateral disconnection, you remove one region from one hemisphere and the other region from the other hemisphere, and you've removed these interactions. But this bit of prefrontal cortex can still interact with the whole of the rest of the brain. This bit of IT can still interact with the whole of the rest of the brain. So the lesion has specifically removed the interaction between the two. So here's what the lesions look like in this group of experiments that I'm going to show you. This is a monkey brain. In gray is the region of cortex that we've removed. These are aspiration lesions, so we're sucking out gray matter and leaving the white matter intact. And we're taking out the material you can see, including going down into the sulci that are touched here, not into the cingulate sulcus, but into all the orbital sulci. On the inferior temporal wall, in the inferior temporal cortex, we're removing basically the whole of IT, going down into the ventral but not dorsal bank of STS. So, when you take out the whole of prefrontal cortex, monkeys can't do a simple single discrimination learning task. What happens with this task when you do this disconnection lesion? And the answer is, it depends. So I'm not going to, you're going to see these figures again. I'm not going to go into the huge details here. All I want you to see is that the monkeys doing these two tasks are doing pretty much exactly the same thing. They're looking at two objects on a screen and selecting one of them. Okay? And due to some manipulations I'm about to talk about, in some cases you get a huge impairment, much worse, percent error, and here, in some cases, you get no error. Okay? So we're doing something more subtle than a prefrontal lesion, and that's what I want you to take from this slide. And what I think we're doing is interrupting the ability to learn to learn. Okay, so what's learning to learn? Here's Harlow again. As we saw, the monkeys gradually learn this task. This is the same task as I showed you before, A versus B. Okay? But what happens if you keep giving the monkey more and more problems? And the answer is he gets better and better. He gets able to learn to learn. And so he always starts at 50%, but after he's done 200 problems of this task, effectively he only needs that one trial in order to learn what's going on, and be it, well, they're 85% after one trial. So they become very efficient, and therefore you could say that they have efficient decision-making at this point. The process of acquiring this ability to learn more efficiently, we refer to as learning set. So here is my schema again. Here's the discrimination learning. When you do enough individual trials of discrimination learning, you gain a learning set, which allows you to do this problem efficiently and then transfer that ability to other problems. So you continue to be more efficient to learn because you have a learning set. Children of 4 years old also acquire learning sets. So these mechanisms are very much present in all primate brains. Here, a number of problems, mean trials to criterion, going down over a period of time. Learning set is a flexible thing. It doesn't just have to be discrimination learning like this. It could also be a different form of learning, reversal learning, where instead of giving new problems each time the monkey learns a criterion, you reverse the problems. So here you go, A plus B minus, but then B plus A minus. Okay, so reversal learning, you do that several times. The monkeys can learn a set to that as well. And indeed, learning set is a flexible thing. It can be transferred between different types of problems. Here's a bunch of monkeys doing the discrimination learning task that I showed before, which is just a different group of monkeys. But if you'd originally given the monkeys a reversal learning set, if they've already got a learning set, they're much better at this task, even though they've never seen it before. Okay, so it's quite a powerful effect, and it's quite a general and generally applicable effect, the learning set. Here's another group of monkeys from a study by Phil Browning, showing them again acquiring a learning set over a period of time, percent error in trials 2 to 11, and this goes down over a set of stages of learning. When you take out prefrontal cortex in one hemisphere of the brain, you have no impairment on this task whatsoever. However, when you complete the disconnection, when you lesion IT in one hemisphere and prefrontal cortex in the other hemisphere, you abolish the learning set. So these monkeys are still able to learn these tasks. They're making 30% error in the first few trials. They're able to get to 100% on this task. That's not what they've lost. What they've lost is the difference between here and here, this advantage. And that's the advantage that was given by the learning set. Okay? So in doing the disconnection lesion, which we refer to it as FL by IT, as the disconnection lesion, in doing this lesion, we've removed the learning set, but left the learning just as it was at the start. Okay, so these monkeys are learning. You might want to say, interpret this, that they're learning with their temporal lobes perfectly well, but they have no way of using this learning set. And we argue that this is a rather specific role of prefrontal cortex. I'm going to go on to give you more information about this. So one question would be, well, if learning set is such an important thing to prefrontal cortex, can you give me an example of a simple learning task without a learning set, and is it impaired by prefrontal cortex lesions? And the answer is yes. Learning set, we believe, is linked to the fact that you can create a prospective memory about what's just happened to you and what's about to happen to you. So in the simple task where you have several trials of A plus, B minus, you create a prospective memory saying, I've just touched A, it gave me a reward, what I'm going to do next is touch A again. Okay, a win, stay, lose, shift, if you like. And that's the simplest possible strategy you could use to do this task. However, that requires you to link together instances of the same problem in time. Okay, that requires you to have a prospective memory that links time 1 when you see A plus B minus and time 2. If you interpose lots of other different problems in between the two instances of A plus B minus, which is called concurrent learning, if you interpose these trials like this, what you do is block the formation of that learning set. So here the monkeys are going to learn about these objects. All of these are objects. Some of them are awarded, some of them are not, in pairs. And each trial, it goes through here. So the monkey goes this trial, this trial, this trial, this trial, this trial. Okay, great. Then we repeat as many times as we need for the monkeys to learn to criteria. Monkeys can learn this task perfectly well. Okay? But the time they take to learn the first set of problems is exactly the same time that they take to learn the 1000th set of these problems. Okay? Here's another, Betsy Murray and David Gaffin showing this. Those are the original results of Harlow that I've showed you before. This is monkeys doing the concurrent task with multiple different objects at the same time. And as you can see, the fact of having more and more problems learnt, the fact of having more and more experience in this task doesn't improve them. They don't learn to learn this task. So we have a simple learning task that requires, that doesn't involve a learning set. Is it impaired by the disconnection of prefrontal cortex from IT? No, it is certainly not. David Gaffin in 2002, showing that concurrent learning is not at all impaired by disconnection of prefrontal cortex from IT. So, prefrontal cortex is doing something rather specific with information that's coming out of IT, and it's doing that only in cases when a learning set is formed. So, can we generalize a little bit more about what's going on? And we have tried to do so and tried to argue that what actually is happening here is that prefrontal cortex allows you to process temporally complex events. A temporally complex event is any event which requires you to bind information that's necessary at two different points in time. So the prospective memory linking trial n and trial n plus 1 that allows you to form a learning set is a cardinal example of a temporally complex event. And our argument is that every time you want to do some learning task that needs temporally complex events, you need prefrontal cortex to act on the information coming out of IT. Okay, that happens to be a testable hypothesis. Hooray. So let's test it. This is the simplest possible test of this hypothesis we could come up with. It generates a nicely counterintuitive behavioral result even before you start doing lesions. Here is a simple discrimination. This is task UD, which is for unfilled delay. The monkeys do a discrimination, that is, they have A plus B minus. We then give them a 2-second blank screen, and then we give them a reward. The only difference between this task and the classic task is the 2-second blank screen. Easy, okay? Second task. Here we have monkeys doing exactly the same thing, a discrimination. One of these objects will always give them a reward when they touch it, no matter what happens afterwards. But in the task 2i, we simply put a second object on the screen during those 2 seconds. That is the only difference between these two tasks, okay? Now, our argument is that monkeys, once they start to become sophisticated in learning, become very good at forming temporally complex events. And what they will do in this task is link the object that they choose with the random object that they see in the sequence with the reward into a temporally complex event and use that to make their learning more efficient. Whereas when they have to wait, when there's a separation in time between the object that they choose and the reward, and there's nothing here to turn into a temporally complex event, they aren't able to use temporally complex events to learn. So that predicts that monkeys are better at this task than this task, even though the decision they make, the choice they have to make, is identical. Okay? This is A plus, this is B minus, this is A plus, this is B minus. Nothing that goes on at this level bears any relation to to the outcome. Okay, so are they better at task 2i than task UD? Yes, they certainly are. These are the control animals, errors to criterion, and as you can see, they make less than half the errors to criterion on task 2i than on task UD. Okay, so this seems to be more evidence that the processing of temporally complex events helps monkeys to learn. And what's more, when you do a frontal temporal disconnection, you abolish only the ability to have this advantage, only the ability to bind the image in the element in the sequence into a temporally complex event and help your learning with it. So as you can see, once you give a prefrontal cortical disconnection lesion to this group, to the monkeys doing task 2i, they learn it just as if there was an unfilled delay. The object doesn't make any difference. Okay, so support of our testable hypothesis number 1. Test number 2 asks whether this is a general hypothesis about different functions of prefrontal cortex. So if we have to come across something that's general, we should be able to apply it to different forms of impairment and different forms of function, executive ones that have been linked to prefrontal cortex. An example is that prefrontal cortex is classically linked to the process of inhibition. The idea being that prefrontal cortex stops the rest of the brain doing all the crazy things it wants to do. Okay, and the cardinal task of this is reversal learning, which I've already showed you once, but I'll just give you another example of it. So the first problem you learn is that A is rewarded and B is not. Once you're good at that, we reverse the contingencies. B is rewarded, A is not. As I said before, monkeys form a learning set to this task, they get very good. If you give monkeys who formed a learning set to this task a prefrontal cortical, prefrontal infratemporal disconnection, they're very impaired. So here are the lesion monkeys, and here are the control monkeys. Control monkeys learn very quickly. This is trial since reversal and mean errors per trial. The lesion monkeys, they are learning. This line is going down, but they're learning very slowly, just like the monkeys who had no learning set in Phil Browning's paper a few slides ago. Okay. And then what happens if we still do reversal learning? So we're still looking at inhibition, classic prefrontal cortical function, but we do it in a concurrent context. So now we're trying to block the formation of the learning set by giving multiple problems in a row before you see the same problem again. So in this version, you get a series of problems just as you did before, but the second time round, we're going to reverse the contingencies of some of these problems, and the third time round, we're going to reverse the ones that weren't reversed before, okay? So it's learning some discriminations and then reversing them, just as in the other task, okay? Only here, there are far more problems to deal with. This is a more complex task. You would have thought this would be harder for the monkeys to do. But the lesion doesn't impair them, okay? So disconnecting prefrontal cortex from IT doesn't impair a reversal learning task unless the monkeys have a reversal learning set, which means that in the domain of visual objects, at the very least, prefrontal cortex is not doing inhibition, okay? And it's, to my knowledge, not possible to posit an inhibitory role for prefrontal cortex in the context of visual information without explaining this result. Okay, so that's the second support for this slightly unusual hypothesis that the role of prefrontal cortex is actually to represent temporally complex events. So this is just to show you how large the difference between these two results is. This is the complex task with concurrent objects. This is where they're learning about one pair of objects at a time. A huge difference. Okay, so at least in the context of visual learning, the role of prefrontal cortex is to represent temporally complex events when they are required. The use of this form of representation, the representation of temporally complex events, renders the decisions in the task both fast and efficient. And I hope that I've been able to show both of those things. And secondly, it can show that studying cortical interactions is crucially important for a revealing function. So now I want to just put some of these results in the context of the sort of larger domain of prefrontal cortex and executive function. And there's a recent book that's come out by Dick Passingham and Steve Wise, which if you're interested in the field, I strongly recommend. And they've tried to come up with some form of synthesis of what prefrontal cortex is doing. So I want to just quote a passage because I thought it resonated very well with what we're proposing. This is the start of their grand function of prefrontal cortex. The fundamental function of granular prefrontal cortex as a whole is to generate the goals, objects, and places that serve as targets of action that are appropriate given the current context and desired outcome. So that's very much executive function speak. Okay? And it seems to me that very few people would disagree with anything that's written in there. The part of this definition which I think is particularly interesting to me, in contrast to phylogenetically older learning systems, to which they're referring effectively to striatum and temporal cortex, its prefrontal cortex can do so attentively on the basis of a single event. And on the basis of a single event is really what we're talking about in learning set. This idea that you learn to learn so that you only need one trial and then you know what's going on. And they go on to echo some of the themes I've been talking about. It does so in two ways, by fast learning and by providing a mechanism for learning and applying abstract rules. And the prospective memory and learning set is, I would argue, the cardinal example of such an abstract rule. Okay, so I'm trying to turn what so far has been a sort of very much learning and memory focused talk round towards suggesting that these mechanisms of learning and memory are actually fundamental to executive function. And these guys are really trying to explain executive function, and that's why I think it's interesting that they're bringing out these ideas. And so earlier on I was talking about executive function, and I said I was going to tell you about making good decisions efficient, and I think that's what learning set does. But I also said I was going to talk about flexibility, and I haven't really done that yet. And I think flexibility moves us much more into the executive domain, and that's what I'm going to talk about now using the concept of task set. Okay. So now I'm talking about work that we're carrying out at the moment here in Lyon, rather than work that's already been done. And so I'm going to try and give you an idea of why I think the executive process of processing task set relates to what I've been talking about so far, and just tell you what we're doing at the moment, and then I'll stop talking. So here's the schema that we've been using. Discrimination learning is a series of trials, and learning set allows you to learn each of these problems very efficiently. So we've got efficient learning. What we now want to do is have, flexible learning as well. So one thing you can do when you want to be flexible is take what you know, this set of learned objects, and change something within it, and see whether you can deal with that change in a plastic and flexible manner. And this is what I refer to as learning set, as task set, sorry. And so in this context, this would be dealing with problems like this. You have a set of problems that you've learned that you're happy with. How well can you adapt to a new set of problems that have certain changed elements, for example here, but certain elements that are retained, for example here. The idea of moving between different tasks in a flexible manner. So how do we extract a task set in a group of monkeys carrying out this sort of task? Well, we're going to, again, try and build up the task from very fundamental basic principles. So here's a single problem, and it's pretty much identical to the discrimination learning before, except now we've separated the objects from the responses. Each square is a possible response, and there are now 3 possible responses instead of 2. That's the only difference. So all monkeys have to do is to learn to associate one object with a particular response for reward. So there's their reward. Okay, so just as in the previous versions, in the discrimination learning version, we can give multiple problems over a period of time, and we can see whether the monkeys acquire a learning set to this problem. And this is an open question. It's never really been tested directly whether monkeys can learn a learning set when you're giving them 3-choice problems as opposed to 2-choice problems. Okay? Once monkeys have a learning set, we can give them another example, another problem, and I'm going to refer now to this grouping of 2 objects and their responses and their relevant responses as a task. Now we can give the monkeys this task, and they can learn using their learning set in a very efficient way. But can they then use that information in a flexible fashion to change what they know about these objects? And we can test that by simply changing these mappings. Okay? And we can give the monkeys a series of these tasks where in each task there is a different pair of relationships between the objects and the responses. Okay? And the question is, can monkeys learn about each of these tasks and retain that information so that when it comes back, they learn it in a more efficient manner? And that's the idea of flexibility. The idea of moving between different tasks here in an efficient manner is the idea of being flexible in memory. So how do we test whether they're using this? And this ability to move between these tasks in a flexible manner, we're calling task set. So how can we test this? Well, in a series of tasks, we can have some that repeat themselves and some that the monkey only sees one time. And the monkey is forming an idea of the relationship between the response and the outcome for each given task. In other words, if the monkey is using a task set, he should be able to retain tasks that he's learned much better than new learnt ones. So this would be an example here. Monkey sees task 1, then task 2. He's never seen them before. He learns them using the learning set that he has. Okay? Then he sees task 1 again. He could learn that from scratch using the learning set that he has. But if he has a task set on top of his learning set, he's also going to retain information from the previous time that he saw it and become more efficient, and so on and so forth. And so we can compare these things. So the question is this ever an effect? Do we see this effect in humans, for example? And the answer is yes. This is some data from Anne Collin and Etienne Coquelin in human subjects in pretty much exactly the task I've just described. Looking at the top figure, in red you can see performance of tasks that the subject has seen before, and in green the task that the subject has not seen before. And as you can see, this is proportion correct. There's a small improvement when you've seen that task before, and that's evidence for the presence of a task set. You can also see here, and this relates back to some of the things that Manu Prosit was talking about a couple of weeks ago, that this also changes the proportion of responses that are exploratory. If in red you've already seen the task before, you're less likely to use exploratory responses in order to try and understand what's going on. Okay. So The project we're engaged in, which is the subject of the Marie Curie Fellowship that I started last year, is a collaboration with the group who did that study before, the group of Etienne Coquelin, and we're investigating these processes in monkeys using techniques to look at interactions between different regions of cortex that they can't look at in humans because they can't intervene on their humans. And so the question really is, how does prefrontal cortex interact with other regions? And one of our targets is the anterior cingulate cortex, in order to subserve task set formation and use. And this is the work of the thesis of Maëlys Varro. And so we've started training the monkeys up on this task. So the monkeys are at this phase here. So they're learning these three-choice problems, and we're trying to understand whether or not these monkeys have acquired the learning set to this. And this would be a novel finding if we can show that monkeys really do form a learning set to this. And here's some data hot off the press this morning showing that monkeys are indeed showing a learning set to this task, to this three-choice task. You can see this is their learning curve over a period of 16 trials, and the proportion correct. And this is the number of problems that they've seen, and after 300 or 400 problems, they're starting to become relatively good at this task in a way that they weren't before. Okay, so the next question is, can monkeys acquire task set? And actually, we don't know yet because we haven't got that far with the monkeys. All I can say is that I think they will, because the presence of a learning set seems to predict if you can get a learning set, you should be able to get a task set as well. And so this is the subject of a bet with Etienne Coquelin. The winner gets a bottle of champagne. So how are we looking at interactions in this task? And we've decided to use the other version of looking at disconnections that I told you about. And this is to use reversible inactivation and electrophysiology. So we implant cannulae in the monkey, and we can infuse drugs to target particular specific regions of cortex and inactivate them in a temporary fashion. And if we're able to simultaneously record from other regions, we can compare the recordings from with and without inactivation of the region of cortex, and therefore understand the mechanism of the interaction between these two. So the use of reversible inactivations coupled to electrophysiology provides a new way of looking at disconnection between cortical regions. So just briefly to show you what we're actually doing in detail, we have these grids of electrodes implanted resting on the surface of the brain. This is electrocorticography. This is a nice stable implant that allows us to record over a period of months from the same electrodes in the same anatomical position in the same monkeys. And so we can also record over multiple different cortical regions at any one time. We then intervene in a very targeted region. So here, for example, I've pointed my fake cannulae at the principal sulcus, inactivate that region, and look at the effect on the whole of the rest of the network, therefore understanding how the rest of the network interacts with these regions. With the region inactivated, we can also target deeper areas such as anterior cingulate cortex here if we do the surgery correctly. So just to finally show on a schematic how much information we can get out from this sort of experiment. So here I've just schematized the sort of set of regions that are very much linked to executive function, the anterior cingulate, lateral prefrontal and sensory motor cortex. And we know that these work together to produce adaptive motor behavior. And if the monkeys have a learning set and a task set, efficient and flexible behavior. And so when we're recording, we can record evoked potentials and oscillatory signals that are related to the function of particular regions, but also more and more we believe that the oscillatory signals that we record in LFP and on the surface relate to the interaction between different cortical regions. Then we can intervene with a cannula. We can inject an agent such as mucimol. Mucimol is an agonist of GABA, and so it increases dramatically the inhibition in a region, and you provide a temporary lesion for a few hours. You stop one region in the network working, and just like my experiments previously, you can look at the effect of that on the behavior. But also, we can look at the effect of this inactivation on the signals that are coming from that area and also the signals that are representing the interactions that that area has with other regions of cortex. So that's the model for the experiment. That's about the end for me. I'm just going to show you again the moral of the story, and I hope that I've convinced you of a few little things here. Firstly, that decision-making becomes efficient and flexible when subjects learn to learn, that this is a fundamental and basic principle of becoming good at decision-making in humans just as much as in monkeys. It's just a slightly slower process in monkeys, so it's easier to see. The sets, the learning set and the task set, formed by learning to learn, require processing of temporally complex events. And I hope I've argued successfully that this is a fundamental role of prefrontal cortex. And finally, just sort of to do some publicity for my favorite techniques, the idea that cortical interactions are really very important, and particularly that looking at them using lesions is really critical. So finally, I'd like to thank the reprobates who helped me out in all of this work, in particular David Gaffin in Oxford, and Phil Browning, with whom I did a lot of the lesion studies, and Emmanuel Prosic here in Lyon, who has given me excellent support for all my time here. Thank you very much.
So, questions? You're now working with cochlear, so we're having an idea about the difference between monkeys and humans. Mm-hmm. And there's an enormous expansion of the prefrontal cortex in the human compared to the monkey. Is the only consequence of that this slight, faster learning to learn process in the human? Is that the only outcome that you see, or are there other important differences?
Well, the first thing to talk about is language. I think language has a huge, huge impact on everything that we're talking about. The ability to, well, the learning curve that I showed of the children of about 3 years old who are acquiring very slowly a discrimination. If they're more advanced linguistically, that learning curve changes hugely and very quickly. And the slope of that learning curve correlates very well with their linguistic abilities at any one point of time. So I think language imposes itself upon these processes very notably. And I think it's obvious that there must be some very complex things going on in human prefrontal cortex that aren't going on in monkey prefrontal cortex. What I find interesting is how close the parallels are between the way in which children are completing these tasks, human children, and the way in which monkeys are completing these tasks. And I think that convinces me, along with some of the lesion results, that we're really looking at something which is quite fundamental in prefrontal cortex, even if humans go on to be able to do much more with it than the monkeys can.
Peter?
If I could paraphrase your conclusions just to make sure I understood them correctly. The temporal cortex alone can learn kind of the statistics of what's happening. So it needs many trials to be rewarded in its learning kind of in a statistical way. Versus the prefrontal cortex can keep in working memory the results of the previous trial and use that to influence the current trial. So could you, I mean, you didn't say that it's working memory much, and also, could you paraphrase that in saying learning to learn is the same as learning to use working memory?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. Yes, I deliberately steered fairly clear of the concept of working memory. Working memory is different, very significantly different from the concept of processing temporally complex events. Working memory is the idea that you have a piece of information and that you hold it in memory across a delay. Okay? It's a very simple idea. The idea of processing temporally complex events is the idea of binding different pieces of information across a temporal period. Okay? So there's a very different processes. I strongly suspect, although I don't want to go too far in this, that actually the concept of working memory in prefrontal cortex is, how far do I go? I suspect it's epiphenomenal. I suspect that what we're actually looking at when we see, for example, cells that fill delay, is the binding of different pieces of information across delays, not the maintenance of single pieces of information across delays. So to go back to your question, is what we're looking at a working memory phenomenon? No, I think it's a strategy. I don't think it's something that's just being held for a short period of time, because monkeys can come back the next day and they've still got a learning set. There's no way that learning set is sitting in working memory.
Right, but in your multiple concurrent problem, where you abolish the ability
They can't form the learning set. The thing they can't do is form the learning set. So you need the problems to be close together in order to form the learning set, but once you've got it, you've got it. Okay? So that's the difference. So do you need working memory in order to form a learning set? Well, I suppose that's one way of interpreting what we're saying, yes. But the thing that you need prefrontal cortex for is once you've formed that, to keep that learning set, because you lose it when we take it out.
Working memory. Does everybody agree with this definition of working memory and prefrontal cortex? I mean, would that be, you hesitated a bit on pushing what seemed to me a very strong...
Because I work for someone who was trained by Patricia Goldham-Rackage. I don't know. I mean, I would be interested what Manu would input into that.
Manu?
I think it's debated. There have been several theories that went beyond working memory. The one of cognitive control, for instance, was an extension according to me, an extension taking into account goals and the rules you apply to information you have to reach your goals. And that's already, go beyond the simple concept of holding information in mind. So binding information in time, I think it's different. For me, it's the data on the feeling of the delay by a cue that helps monkey to bind the target with the outcome. It's something that shows that probably there's something else than just working memory. And so for me, it doesn't tell me that prefrontal cortex is not doing working memory, but it tells that certainly it's doing something else, which is very important to form sets or learning sets.
And the classic example of working memory is the delayed response task. So when you have to, you're shown what the answer is. So normally it's hand testing of monkeys. You show a peanut, you put it underneath two wells, and if you make the monkey wait, then he needs his prefrontal cortex to wait. That's the delayed response task. It's a task that's much debated. There's a very little cited paper by Malmo in 1964 where they did the delayed response task, and the only manipulation that what you do is you have monkeys with a lesion in prefrontal cortex. In those days it was the lesion of principal sulcus, and what you do is you show that when there's no delay, the monkey can do the task, but when you impose a delay, the monkey gets worse and worse at the task as the delay gets longer and longer. And this is the idea that the longer you need to wait, the more you need your prefrontal cortex to hold that information. So the manipulation by Malmo is that when you put the delay on, you just turn off the lights. And when you turn off the lights, there's no delay-dependent impairment in delayed response task. So the delayed response task is not about holding information in memory. It's about not being distracted during the delay, I would argue.
Any other questions? What happens if you do this disconnection to a learning process which is already engaged? Is it lost?
It's a very interesting question, and it's one of the nice things about the way that we're now doing disconnections, because we can implant monkeys and get them to start learning and then interrupt them with the disconnections halfway through. What we've never done is make the lesion halfway through the learning process.
So what would your prediction be?
My prediction would be that in a task where you were, for example, acquiring a learning set, that you would lose any learning set that you've acquired, and go back to how you were learning when you were just using your temporal lobe.
Okay, any last quick question? Thank you very much, that was great.